Government institutions. Mexico is a federal republic, though the state and local governments have little independent power and few resources. Historically, the executive branch, with its strong presidency, has had all the power, while the legislature and judiciary followed the executive's lead, rubber-stamping executive decisions. Though Mexico is democratic in name, traditionally the country has been authoritarian and corporatist. Since the 1980s, the government and its citizens have made significant changes, so that, more and more, Mexico is practicing democracy and federalism. An important consequence of growing party competition has been that state governors have become more willing to exercise their formal powers. According to the Constitution of 1917, Mexican political institutions resemble those of the United States. The three branches of the government theoretically check and balance one another, and many public officials, including the president, both houses of the legislature, and governors, are directly elected by the people. In practice, however, the Mexican system is very different from that of the United States. The Mexican Constitution is very long and easily amended, and the government can best be described as a strong presidential system. The executive. A remarkable thing happened in the presidential election of 2000. The PRI candidate did not win. Instead, Vicente Fox, candidate for the combined PAN-PRD parties, won with almost 43% of the vote. He edged out Francisco Labastida, the PRI candidate, who garnered not quite 36%. This election has far-reaching implications, since the structure of the government is built around the certainty that the PRI candidate will win. This election may have marked the decline of patron clientelism and the beginning of a true democratic state. The election of Felipe Calderón in 2006 secured PAN's control of the presidency, but since he only received about 36% of the vote, only 0.5% more than the PRD's Obrador, he had to build a coalition cabinet. In 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto captured the presidency for PRI, but only with 38% of the vote. Peña Nieto's cabinet is a mix of business-oriented technocrats and veteran PRI party insiders, but a few members are from outside the party. PRI failed to win a majority in either house of the legislature. Since the formation of PRI, policymaking in Mexico is centered on the presidency. The president, through the patron-client system, was virtually a dictator for his sexenio, a non-renewable 6-year term. The incumbent always selected his successor, appointed officials to all positions of power in the government and PRI, and named PRI candidates for governors, senators, deputies, and local officials. Until the mid-1970s, Mexican presidents were considered above criticism, and people revered them as symbols of national progress and well-being. As head of PRI, the president managed a huge patronage system and controlled a rubber-stamp Congress. The president almost always was a member of the preceding president's cabinet. Despite recent changes, the Mexican president remains very powerful. During his sexenio, Vicente Fox has had to manage Mexico without the supporting patron-client system of PRI behind him. His predecessor, Ernesto Zedillo, had responded to pressure to democratize by relinquishing a number of the traditional powers of the presidency. For example, Zedillo announced that he would not name his PRI successor, the candidate in 2000, but that the party would make the decision. Even so, President Fox inherited a job that most people still saw as all-powerful, and they often blamed him for failing to enact many of his promised programs, despite the fact that he did not have a strong party in Congress or many experienced people in government. Although PRI won the presidency in 2012, no single party has had a majority in the legislature, and Mexico's evolution of a multi-party system continues, a trend that impacts the president's ability to control policymaking. The bureaucracy. Almost 1.5 million people work in the federal bureaucracy, most of them in Mexico City. More government employees staff the schools, state-owned industries, and semi-autonomous agencies of government, and hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats fill positions in state and local governments. Officials are generally paid very little, but those at high and middle levels have a great deal of power. Under PRI control, all were tied to the patron-client system and often accepted bribes and used insider information to promote private business deals. Under PRI, the parastatal sector, composed of semi-autonomous or autonomous government agencies, was huge. These companies often produced goods and services that in other countries were carried out by private individuals, and the Mexican government owned many of them. The best-known parastatal is Pemex, the giant state-owned petroleum company. After the oil bust of the early 1980s, reforms eliminated many parastatals, and the number has continued to dwindle, so that many of them are now privately owned. President Fox pushed for privatization of Pemex, but did not succeed, and President Enrique Peña Nieto has proposed significant reforms that would affect the operation of the energy giant and its relationship to the government. The Legislature. The Mexican legislature is bicameral, with a 500-member Chamber of Deputies and a 128-member Senate. All legislators are directly elected. Deputies have 3-year terms, and senators have 6-year terms. Like the Russian Duma until 2007, the Chamber of Deputies includes some deputies, 300, who are elected from single-member districts, and others, 200, who are elected by proportional representation. Unlike the Russian upper house, the Federation Council, which is filled with appointed representatives, the Mexican Senate is also directly elected by a combination of the electoral methods. 3 senators are elected from each of 31 states, and the federal district, Mexico City, with the remaining senators selected by proportional representation. Although legislative procedures look very similar to those of the United States, until the 1980s, the legislature remained under the president's strict control. PRI's grip on the legislature slipped earlier than it did in the presidency. The growing strength of opposition parties, combined with legislation that provided for greater representation of minority parties, proportional representation, in Congress, led to the election of 240 opposition deputies in 1988. After that, presidential programs were no longer rubber-stamped, but were open to real debate for the first time. President Salinas' reform programs, then, were slowed down, and for the first time, the Mexican government experienced some gridlock. In 1997, PRI lost a majority in the Chamber of Deputies, when 261 deputies were elected from opposition parties. The election of 2000 gave PRI a bare plurality, but far from a majority in both houses. In the election of 2003, the pattern held, with voters selecting 224 PRI deputies to 149 for PAN and 97 for PRD. In the election of 2006, PRI support slipped in both houses. PAN gained some seats in the Chamber of Deputies, and PRD made big gains in both houses. In the 2009 midterm elections, with only deputies up for election, PRI again gained control of the lower house, but only could muster a majority by forming a coalition with a minority Green Party. In 2012, PRI's representation in the Chamber of Deputies slipped by 32 seats, and in the Senate the party gained 2, resulting in 52 seats out of 128. In 2015, PRI won 203 seats, a slight loss, but PRD slipped from 100 to 56 seats. Minor parties collectively won 133 seats, a notable increase from 79. The developing multi-party system also encouraged the implementation in 2002 of an election law that required political parties to sponsor women candidates. Parties must run at least 30% women from both lists for the proportional representation election, as well as candidates for the single-member district states. In an effort to regain some of its lost clout, PRI has exceeded the requirements by instituting a 50% quota for its candidates. A minor party, Social Democrats and Farmers, ran Patricia Mercado in 2006 for the presidency, and in 2012, PAN's candidate was Josefina Vázquez Mota, who came in third with just over 25% of the vote. As competitive multi-party systems began to emerge, the Mexican Congress has become a more important forum for various points of view. Competitive elections are the rule in many locales, and the number of safe seats is declining. The legislature has challenged recent presidents on a number of occasions, but whether or not a true system of checks and balances is developing is still unclear. Judiciary. A strong judicial branch is essential if a country is to be ruled by law, not by the whim of a dictator. Mexico does not yet have an independent judiciary, nor does it have a system of judicial review. Like most other non-English-speaking countries, it follows code law, not common law. Even though the Constitution of 1917 is still in effect, it is easily amended and does not have the same level of legitimacy as the U.S. Constitution does. Mexico has both federal and state courts, but because most laws are federal, state courts have played a subordinate role. If states continue to become more independent from the central government, the state courts almost certainly will come to play a larger role. The Supreme Court is the highest federal court, and on paper it has judicial review, but in reality, it almost never overrules an important government action or policy. Historically, then, the courts have been controlled by the executive branch. most specifically, the president. As in the United States, judges are officially appointed for life. In practice, judges resign at the beginning of each sexenio, allowing the incoming president to place his loyalists on the bench as well as in the state houses, bureaucratic offices, and party headquarters. The administration of Ernesto Zedillo, 1994 to 2000, tried to strengthen the courts by emphasizing the rule of law. Increasing interest in human rights issues by citizens groups and the media has put pressure on the courts to play a stronger role in protecting basic freedoms. Citizens and the government are increasingly resorting to the courts as a primary weapon against corruption, drugs, and police abuse. President Zedillo often refused to interfere with the court's judgments, and Vicente Fox promised to work for an independent judiciary, although the results were disappointing to many people. The strength of the judiciary is limited by the general perception that judges are corrupt, especially at the local level, where many decisions are made. In areas of Mexico where drug wars currently rage, many judges are afraid to rule against gang leaders for fear of reprisal, and others almost certainly are bribed into compliance. As part of Calderon's reform package, federal and state courts conducted oral trials in which lawyers have to argue before the bench rather than simply push papers across a clerk's desk. It is hoped that the change will improve methods of gathering and presenting evidence in court. Calderon also pushed through a change in the criminal appeal system that makes it harder for the accused to frivolously block or delay prosecutions. In 2011, the president stated that his long-term goal is for judicial institutions that Mexico has too long lacked and without which the advance of criminals is understandable, and a future for Mexico is incomprehensible. In 2013, President Peña Nieto announced plans to add a constitutional amendment to permit Congress to pass a Uniform Procedures Code and a new general criminal law, abolishing 31 state codes. This may be difficult, since several previous presidents have tried and failed to unify the criminal codes. For example, Mexico City allows abortion, but it is a crime in most states. Military. Military generals dominated Mexican politics throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. The military presided over the chaos, violence, and bloodshed of the era following the Revolution of 1910, and it was the competitiveness of its generals that caused PRI to dramatically cut back the military's political power. Although all presidents of Mexico were generals until the 1940s, they still acted to separate the military from politics. Even critics of PRI admit that gaining government control of the military is one of the party's most important accomplishments. Over the past 50 years, the military has developed into a relatively disciplined force with a professional officer corps. Much credit for depoliticizing the military belongs to Plutarco Calles and Lázaro Cárdenas, who introduced the idea of rotating the generals' regional commands. By moving generals from one part of the country to another, the government kept them from building regional bases of power, and true to the old patron-client system, presidents traded favors with military officers, such as business opportunities, so that generals could enjoy economic, if not political, power. The tendency to dole out favors to the military almost certainly has led to the existence of strong ties between military officers and the drug trade. In recent years, the military has been heavily involved in efforts to combat drug trafficking, and rumors abound about deals struck between military officials and drug barons. In 2009, Calderon created an entirely new police force that formed part of Mexico's first national crime information system, which stores the fingerprints of everyone arrested in the country. This force has assumed the role of the army in several parts of the country. The federal police enjoy greater public confidence than do state and local police, and President Peña Nieto has promised to draft 40,000 soldiers to serve on the federal police force.